the government believes that they're a terrorist organization. Now, I think, you've got to look at it from, two perspectives. One of it is that, terrorism is in the, is labeled by the most powerful. So if the government says it's a terrorist organization, they have the power to designate it. The parliament has been able to pass that legislation to declare it as a terrorist organization. But the other perspective is, what kind of activities are they carrying out? If their activities are akin to terrorism as defined by the Nigerian law, then it means the Nigerian government has the right to do that, under its own sovereign laws. Now, whether IPOB should be declared as a terrorist organization is one that one needs to look into the nitty-gritties. But I think what the government should have done, or could have, or would have done, is to have some kind of a dialogue with the leaders of this organization, including Nnamdi Kanu himself. I mean, now he's been arrested. Some say, it was rendition. Some say it was state kidnapping. Others say it was an abduction. So there is no clear message as to, or clear information as to what really transpired. Kenya has refused any engagement in this. The Nigerian government has been tight-lipped in terms of where they got Nnamdi Kanu from. So it's been made worse by the fact that some of his supporters have, were promised to and threatened to storm Abuja, where, the court case, was being held today. I think perhaps that could be one of the reasons why the DSS, could not produce him, because they were afraid that, the court could be stormed by his supporters. It's a complex case, but I think the solution is not to make it worse. And, if I were in the shoes of the Nigerian government, I would look at this from a much more engagement and dialogue angle, rather than from, escalating the crisis to a much more deadly angle.
The Biafra War was late 60s through to the 70s, 1970. Sadly, millions died because of starvation, because of the blockade at the time. But this war clearly isn't something that's just disappeared, and is still a sensitive issue. By jailing someone like Kanu, could they be inciting more secessionist feelings, more Biafra nationalist feeling?
I think, the whole idea is the government believes that by cutting the head of the snake, it therefore kills the snake. But in cases of separatist group, it doesn't actually, have that same equation. When you take out one leader, if you imprison them or you put them, or even you eliminate them, it doesn't actually stop the hundreds and thousands of followers who still believe that for one reason or another, there is a realistic or perceived marginalization, or they believe that they don't have a sense of belonging in the state. It's not just coming from groups like IPOB. We've seen same kind of rhetorics from the Yoruba groups known as the Oduduwa People's Republic. They too, as your correspondent had mentioned, having that kind of a feeling as well. But I think all these cries and calls and agitations for secession is a call for the government of Nigeria to adjust, for the government of Nigeria to apply some kind of a decentralization, a restructuring of the states, so that, all the 36 states, should feel that they have the power, to have the control, as the federation does demand. I think it's not about really dividing the country. I think African countries, should be united, not being divided. Now, I'm not opposed to secession, because secession is not a crime. Self-determination is something that is allowed by international law. But Africa is better united. And the only way to do this is if governments come out with strategies that will stop people from thinking that we don't belong to this country.
All right. I'm just wondering if this could escalate to another civil war, or was that highly unlikely?
I think it's very unlikely. The wars of the 1960s, which is precisely 67 to 70, I think. These are different times, and I think that Nigerians, know much more better. I don't see, this coming to a point where there will be a split of the country. But nevertheless, if things, hit the fan as it may, then you could see a country which is, united, just by name, but, separated, by ideology. It will not stop Nigeria from being a sovereign state, but they would also not have, their so-called Biafra state. So I think what the Nigerian government doesn't want is to create a perpetual instability in the southern part of the country, championed by so-called secessionist groups aligned to IPOB. I think what would be much more useful for the government is to try and get to the nitty-gritties of why are these people thinking that they don't belong to the country. And this should go for any other country, be it Cameroon, which is a neighboring state. Of course, the Nigerian government has supported, Cameroon, to quell the secessionist movements there. But what I think both countries should do, and particularly Nigeria, is to engage in a dialogue with these leaders and talk to them and see how they can arrive at a much more non-violent solution to this crisis.
You've mentioned Cameroon, and it is interesting, and I wonder if it's coincidental, but 1961, southern Cameroons, which is now Ambazonia, depending on which side of the political circle you are, nearly became part of Nigeria. And that would have automatically been part of Biafra, I'm guessing, given the geographical location. So the secessionist ideals right next door, secessionist ideals in Biafra, is this coincidental or a continual headache from the colonial era that just can't be ignored?
These are all the remnants of, the so-called Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, which literally split Africa into various spheres of influence. You rightly mentioned that in 1961 there was a plebiscite in which the northern part of Cameroon decided, to join the, then the Federal Republic of Nigeria, and the southern part of Cameroon opted to join the French Cameroon, as a federal state. I mean, and that is why you now have the same or the similar kind of conflict, although slightly different, because the difference is that the southern Cameroon had gained independence by joining the La République du Cameroun, which is the French part of Cameroon. So, that agitation has been because, the southern Cameroonians believe that, rightly so, that there has been a very high level of marginalization, that the 1972 referendum, took away the federation state, which, had equal status, and now, they seem to be a minority in a 10 regional settlement. And, all complaints of, educational marginalization, be it on the judiciary and the language of the people, has been ignored by the government. And that has resulted to the same kind of, conflict that we see in Nigeria. So it's not a coincidence. I think it's all about governance. I think both states have to realize that, if things are left the way they are, there is a likelihood that these two regions might one day, come together and create more chaos in that particular region. Yeah. The peaceful approach is always better.
Yeah, and quite likely that another Nnamdi Kanu will probably rise to lead this resistance. But let's move to Mozambique now. We've seen Rwandan forces deployed in the country, engaging with militants there. And reports are that 30 of these militants have been taken out, literally, by Rwandan forces. Explain to us the significance of having Rwandan forces on the ground and also SADC now deploying forces there.
I think the significance is that for the first time, we're seeing African forces going to the aid of other African forces in a counter-insurgency operation. It is also the first time for Rwandan forces to engage in this kind of, warfare, which is asymmetric, dealing directly with terrorist groups that are linked to the Islamic State. Of course, Rwanda has a huge experience in peacekeeping missions. I think they've engaged in about 14 of those, and one of the countries that have, done a lot of peacekeeping missions. But this is no peacekeeping mission, and quickly so. I believe that part of the force deployment operations that they've carried out, would be to let them know that this is going to be a different warfare. You'll be dealing with an enemy that is very tricky, with an enemy that is invincible, and you've got to really be on the game. But what makes Rwandan forces and what would make them to be effective, and that applies to SADC forces, which could be South African forces, Botswanan forces, Tanzanian forces, and also there is talk of some Zimbabwean forces being on ground. Now, what will make their landing soft would be on how effectively they do coordinate with Mozambican forces. The successes that Rwandan forces have been recording is a joint operation, and we've heard that one of the key junctions, known as the Ewase Junction, which was a very powerful stronghold, of the jihadists, has been taken over. So now the location around Mueda, around Musimba de Praio and Palma, this is now, a location that the jihadists used to hold, but this has now been taken. So I think early progress has been made. We're still waiting for most of the SADC, standby forces to be deployed. We know that they've already deployed advanced troops on ground, but these are not yet involved in operations. So once they do land on ground, it would be great to see how much they can coordinate. But they should always leave politics aside, and make sure that the principal aim is to bring back peace to the northern part of Mozambique.
Do you think that this could be a long, protracted war? Because if there's one thing we've seen dealing with militant insurgencies, is that it is not as simple as just going in there, having some fights, and that's the end of the story. New fighters are born, recruited, and it ends up being 10 years.
And this is why this is the new war. And the forces that have been deployed to these countries will quickly realize that, they're dealing with enemies that have time on their side. They're very tricky, they're invincible, and they would want them to experience war fatigue. I mean, look at examples of Nigeria. They've been fighting the so-called Islamic State of West Africa province and the Boko Haram faction for the past decade. America was involved in Afghanistan for almost 20 years. And what are we seeing? We're seeing a return of the Taliban, back into Afghanistan. They're seizing territory at large. So, it's a long war. It's a mission specific. So nobody knows how long it's going to take. And sooner rather than later, most of these, foreign forces would begin to feel the difference. They'll begin to have the pains. They'll begin to, experience casualties. They will lose some of their soldiers. And, they'll quickly realize that, this is an asymmetric war and it takes long and, you've got to deal with it. So it's not a quick fix, that, the SADC or Rwandan forces or other forces, will think that, okay, this is going to take a year or two. This is going to be a long war. The jihadists have been there for 4 years. Give it another 10 years before you begin to realize, how progress is being made. Let early successes, by Rwandan and Mozambican forces not be confused, because the jihadists have a tendency to go into hiding for years and then come back, with force. It's a long one.